We're entering a new sermon series, for those of you that were not aware. We've just started into the season of Lent. And Lent is it's kind of all about giving things up, right? So our sermon series is going to be about giving different various aspects of our lives up, giving them over to God, right? And today, we're talking about one that I feel like is kind of difficult for any of us, right? It's kind of difficult for all of us. We're talking about giving up control. Now, I don't know about you, but I kind of like to be in control of my own life, right? I'm not a control freak, exactly. Like, I don't really care what you do with your life, like, you're in control of your life. But I like to have a little bit of power and control and authority over the things that happen in my own life, right? I really do. Like, I like to be able to make things happen so that I have things happen that I like to have happen, right? So I think if that sentence makes any sense at all. Sorry, I didn't confuse you all this morning, but wake up, here we go. So I like to be able to have a little bit of control over my life. So if you're anything like me, every now and then this happens, right? If you're cruising along, life is great, and then a massive speed bump that comes up on the horizon, right? And you hit it, and it jars everything loose, and everything's messed up, right? Caroline and I had a week kind of like this earlier this week. It's funny how when you're getting ready to teach on these things or preach on these things, opportunities, let's say, come up to understand exactly what you're preaching about, right? So earlier this week, we had a little bit of a cold snap at the beginning of the week. Well, at some point, either before or during the cold snap, the cover blew off of our crawl space, and all of our pipes are under our crawl space, right? So our pipes froze solid. And I mean solid. Like, we couldn't get anything out of the faucets, the drains froze, we couldn't run water, and we couldn't drain water. So it was frozen solid, right? Eventually our landlord called underneath there, he put a heater under there, and of course, he thaws out and water is gushing out underneath the crawl space. And our house is not nice, you would say. But there's water gushing out, and so all this to say, long story short, 4 days and no hot showers later, we finally had water back, but not because of anything that I was able to do, right? I had to give control of that over to somebody who knew what they were doing, because I am not a plumber. I'm awful at plumbing. You can ask anybody. I'm terrible at it, right? And so I had to give control over it, and I was sitting there like, when do I get to take a hot shower again? Because this is driving me nuts, right? So we all have moments like this, right, where we feel a little bit powerless, and we don't really like to give up control all that often. We like to kind of hold on to it and use it for ourselves, right? So when we find Jesus in our passage this morning, he's kind of in this grand experience of giving up control, right? He's kind of in this amazing grand experiment of giving control of literally everything over to God, right? He's been out in the wilderness. For a little bit of context, he's just been baptized by John the Baptist. And so John the Baptist, he baptizes him, and the Spirit of God comes down and he's like, this is my son, and I love him, and he's great. And then he immediately goes out into the desert. And it's not just like wilderness, like we think of wilderness with trees and all. It's a desert, right? It is sand and maybe a cactus or two, but it is a desert, right? So he goes out into this desert, and he fasts for 40 days and 40 nights. 40 days and 40 nights. For any of you who have fasted for even a day before, you know how miserable it is to go without food for a day, right? For some of us, a day feels like our limit, right? It feels like I'm dying here, like I gotta eat, right? But for some of us, maybe 40 minutes feels like our limit for the kind of time, right? But for most of us, we feel like at the end of that day, oh my gosh, give me a spaghetti, and give me some bread, and give me everything, because I gotta refill these calories, right? Because I'm so hungry. But Jesus has been out in the desert for 40 days and 40 nights, fasting in the desert. Don't miss this, right? Now, there are a lot of important kind of theological points in this story that we're going to kind of dig into today. And one of them is this 40 days, right? There's an interesting thing here, right? There are a lot of important 40s in the Bible. But the one that comes to mind immediately when we hear about Jesus in the desert for 40 days is Israel in the desert for 40 years, right? And so there's this kind of an interesting symbolism thing happening, this interesting mirroring thing that's happening, where Jesus, he goes out and he's tempted in the wilderness for 40 days. He is kind of like symbolically recreating Israel's experience, right? He's symbolically becoming Israel in this sense, to show that it is possible to follow God in the wilderness, right? Right after this, he goes and takes 12 disciples who also symbolize the 12 tribes of Israel. So there's all these little interesting things. We're going to kind of dig into some more of them a little bit later on. But basically, Jesus is out in the wilderness and he is reestablishing a version of Israel, right? But this time, it's a chosen people, but it's not chosen based on where you're born or who you're born to. It's based on your response to Jesus himself. Right? And so instead of having to be born into it, you get to choose, right? We get to choose whether we want to be part of this new nation of people or not. But anyway, Jesus is out in the desert for 40 days, right? And I love the way the Bible puts things sometimes. It says he'd been out there fasting for 40 days, and after 40 days, he was hungry. It's like, of course. Like, yeah, probably. Like, of course he was hungry. He hadn't eaten anything for 40 days, right? He's out there and he's hungry and he's weak. And it's at this moment that Satan decides to show up. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? It happens, I feel like that happens in every single one of our lives. It's like when you're weak, when you're feeble, when you're not feeling it, that's when Satan decides to show up. That's when he decides to show up and be like, hey, you should go do this thing that you're not supposed to do. Right? That's kind of how it works typically. That seems to be the way that it works out. And so he shows up, and Jesus is super hungry, and he comes to Jesus and says, dude, Jesus, bro, you're like really hungry. You should take some of these rocks, because there's rocks all over the place here. You should take one of these. You should turn into a nice loaf of bread for yourself. You should take a bite out of that bread. That would be delicious. You should make some bread out of these rocks. You should eat it. Right? You should do that. You should do. Of course, Jesus responds by saying, man doesn't just live on food. He lives on every word that comes out of the mouth of God. He rejects him, flat out. Right? I've heard several explanations for why exactly it would have been a sin for Jesus to make bread out of rocks, but the one that I've heard that makes the most sense is also kind of the simplest. It's just the fact that he had committed himself to fast, right? He committed himself to this, and if he'd gone back on it, he would have been going back on his word to God in order to sin, right? But whatever the case, it would have been a sin, so he says, no, I'm not going to do this. He rejects him. So Satan, he takes him into Jerusalem. Right? And he takes him up on top of the temple. Now, the temple was probably a pretty tall building to begin with, but also remember, the temple was on top of a mountain, right? So he took him up to the highest point of the temple, and out on the edge of the roof. So he's probably looking out over the edge of the roof down into a valley. So he's really high up there, right? He's probably like 100 to 200 feet in the air. Like he's really high up, right? And Satan has him look over and he says, hey, dude, Jesus, Here's what you should do. Here's what you should do. You should throw yourself off. Yeah. You should throw yourself off. Because, it says in the Bible, and by the way, this is actually in the Bible, it's in Psalm 91:11, I looked it up. It says in the Bible that God, he'll send his angels. And the angels will come and they'll scoop you up and they won't even let you stub your toe. It won't even happen. Right? You won't even stub your toe. God is going to protect you. He's not going to let anything bad happen to you. And Jesus, of course, he rejects him again, right? He says, do not put the Lord your God to the test. It's like, oh man, Jesus, you're getting intense here, right? This is an intense story. I love this story, right? And again, I've heard a couple reasons for why this would have been a sin. First of all, we're not supposed to test God. Right? We're not supposed to test God. It's not wrong to test his will, but to test him, to say, I don't believe you. I need to make sure that you are who you say you are. That's wrong. Right? It's not okay for us to test who God is. Right? But the other reason that I've heard that I think is pretty compelling is this idea that, bear in mind that the temple was like a mega church. Right? There were always people there. There were always people at the temple. And if Jesus had thrown himself off, you can bet that somebody would have seen him get picked up by a bunch of angels, right? And you can bet that they would have glorified and worshipped him right then and there. but his time hadn't come yet, right? He had already handed over control of his base human hunger, right? And here he hands over control over taking glory for himself, right? He says, it's not time for me to be glorified and worshipped yet. I'm going to take the control of this. I'm going to hand it back over to God and let him glorify me in his own time, in his own way. Consistently hands control back over to the Father. Finally, Matthew writes that Satan took Jesus up onto a mountaintop, right? And he looks out across, and I don't know if this is like a mind's eye kind of thing. I've never quite understood how this works, but somehow Satan shows him all the kingdoms on the planet, right? He points out all the kingdoms. He points out this kingdom and that king, and this kingdom and that king. He says, hey, Jesus, bro. All of these belong to me, which is kind of scary if you think about it, right? Like Satan says, all these kingdoms belong. It's like, ooh, that's not good, right? He says, all these kingdoms belong to me, and I'll give them to you. You can have them. You can have every single one of these. You can have all the power on the planet if you just, bow down and worship me a little bit, just a little bit. Just bow down and worship me. You can have all of this. And of course, Jesus says, get away from me. Because the Bible says, worship God and only serve him. Only God are you supposed to serve. Now, I feel like the sin that this would have been is pretty obvious, right? We're not supposed to worship Satan, right? It's pretty straightforward. You're not supposed to worship Satan. But there's also a second aspect here. There's a second thing to think about, and that is that Jesus, even though he is God and he has a right to power, right? He rejects that power and he gives it back to God. But again, he gives control over that back to God one last time. Right? And he says, this is God's power. He will give me the power that I need to have in his own good time. Right? He hands that control over consistently, over and over and over. And of course, after all this, Satan leaves, angels come, attend to Jesus' needs, he goes off, starts his ministry, and the whole world is changed forever because of what he's done. Right? Now, this is a pretty awesome story. This is one of my favorite stories because we get to see Jesus at his best here, really. I mean, yes, the miracle stories are great, and of course, like the resurrection is second to none, but this is a close second, right? Because we get to see Jesus facing off against Satan himself and winning, right? How cool is that? We get to look at Jesus facing off against the father of darkness himself and winning, right? It's super cool. And he does this by doing two things. He consistently quotes Scripture over and over and over again, right? Satan even tries to twist Scripture because he's able to do that, right? But Jesus, he quotes Scripture correctly understood over and over and over again and beats him back with that, but then he constantly and consistently relinquishes control over his situations back to God. He doesn't try to cling on to that control, he hands it over. Right? So even though he was himself God and could be in control, he decides not to. He decides to hand that control back to the Father and let him do what he sees fit to do. And I'll be honest, I struggle with that. Right? I tend to wind up a lot more like another story in the Bible. Right? I tend to wind up a lot more like a story that has two people in it, where they also face off with the devil and they lose in a big way. Right? For that story, we're going all the way back to almost the beginning. We're going back to Genesis chapter 3. At the beginning of that chapter, at the beginning of Genesis 3, we have a perfect world still. Right? The fall has not happened yet. The world is perfect. Excuse me. Adam and Eve are in a perfect relationship with God. They're in a perfect relationship with each other. It is beautiful. It is wonderful. It is great, right? And then Satan shows up, as he tends to do, right? Satan shows up and he comes in and he begins talking to these two, right? We kind of get this picture that it was just Eve that he was talking to, but he's really talking to both of them, right? He's talking to Adam and Eve, and he first comes with like falsehood. And then he moves on to a lie, and then he moves on to blasphemy, right? And it escalates, and bad things happen. Right? He comes in, and first he says to Eve, he says, hey, did God really say to you that you're not allowed to eat any fruit from any tree in the garden? And he was like, oh, no. He said that we're allowed to eat from any tree except for this tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If we eat from that one, or if we touch it, we're going to die, right? So then Satan moves into his lie. He's like, no, you're not going to die. And then he moves into his lie. He says, God knows that if you eat from it, you'll be just like him. Fantastic, right? And so he says, God knows that if you eat from it, you'll be just like him. Now, here's where some of these theological ideas come in again, right? Don't miss this parallel. Satan brings up food they're not supposed to eat. He brings up the idea that they won't be punished, that they won't, a bad thing won't happen to them if they do a thing they're not supposed to do, right? And then he brings up, he says that they will be incredibly powerful if they just do what he says. You see this parallel here, right? With Jesus, he brings up bread he's not supposed to eat, and then he brings up a thing he probably shouldn't do, right? And then he brings up the fact that he will be really powerful if he just does what Satan says to do. That's a crazy parallel, isn't it? It's a really interesting parallel. I've always found that super crazy and super amazing. And of course, Adam and Eve, they eat the fruit, they learn about good and evil, and as a result, we get sin and shame and death and destruction, and it's awful, right? It's no good. But in the story of Jesus in the wilderness, we see not just this symbolic reestablishment of Israel, we also see a symbolic reestablishment of the human race as a whole, right? We see Jesus acting not just as new Israel, but also as a new Adam, right? He gets to act like a new Adam symbolically, right? All of creation has been waiting for this moment for centuries, for millennia. They've been waiting for this moment forever. They're waiting to see, is the Son of God going to succeed, or is the Son of Adam going to fail again? Right? It's like this reestablishment of Adam and Eve all over again. And of course, Jesus succeeds. Right? He succeeds where Adam failed. So he symbolically gets symbolically and in reality, he gets to begin to undo the evil work that Satan has been doing since the beginning of time, right? Where Adam's sin brought in sin to the whole world, Jesus' virtue begins to take sin out of it. Isn't that amazing? That's incredible to me, right? Paul puts it this way in 1 Corinthians 15, 21 through 22. He says, "For death came through a man, and the resurrection of the dead also comes through a man. For in Adam all die, but in Christ all will be made alive." Adam's sin brings death to all of us, right? But Jesus' virtue brings us life. So by standing firm against these temptations that Satan is throwing at him, Jesus proves that he's the perfect candidate to begin to fix what sin has broken. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as Easter gets closer, right? That's really what Easter is all about. Jesus being this perfect candidate to fix what is broken. But for today, it's enough, I think, for us to realize that that's a thing, right? That Jesus begins to undo sin in our lives. And so there are a few ways that I think this fits in our lives, right? A few things that I kind of want us to think about as we kind of wind down here. First, I honestly kind of think that it's important for us to think about some of these deeper theological issues, right? To think about these things. And I think that's important because, first of all, it kind of keeps us humble, right? It keeps me humble, at least. I'm going to school for theology, and every time I learn a new thing, I'm just like, oh my goodness, like, I knew far less than I thought I did, right? But also, wow, like I am part of something that is so much bigger than just me, right? And when you realize that you're part of something that is so much bigger and so much more than you, your selfishness and your pride, they kind of start to dwindle a little bit. Right? They kind of start to go away a little bit when you realize that you're part of something bigger. But second, and maybe on a more tangible level, this tale of two Adams, right? Or this tale of two Israels, it kind of gives us a glimpse into relinquishing control in our own lives, right? In this eternal cosmic struggle against sin, Adam and Eve, they lost out big because they tried to take control over everything they had, and in the end they lost it all, right? They gave into sin by trying to cling on to the things that they wanted, and they lost it all in the end, right? But Jesus understood that the stakes were too high for that. Well, that seems a little bit counterintuitive, but he understood that in order for things to work out the way that they needed to work out, he needed to not cling to it, he needed to release it so that God could do what God wanted to do. And so because he did that, he was able to win out over temptation, and God was able to work the plan and do the thing that he had always intended to do. And so I guess my question this morning is in our own lives, how often does taking control cost us in the end? Right? How often do we miss out on a blessing because we weren't willing to let God do the things that God wanted to do? Right? Because we were too scared or too intimidated or too whatever to let God do what God does. Right? How often do we make a mess of things because we fail to recognize God's voice and then do what it says? Right? Do what he tells us to do. I'll be honest, I do this all the time, right? Like, I'm not always good at this. Like, I'm not always good at being a good Christian, you know? But the further I go into God's grace, the more I understand that when I give things up, things work out the way that they're supposed to work out. Right? That doesn't mean you get to sit back and do nothing and just be like, well, God's got it, he can do it, it's over, right? That means that you got to seek out the things that he wants you to do, and you got to act on those things, right? That means choosing to listen for what he's telling you to do, choosing to listen for his voice and follow what it says. So, maybe this morning you got this, right? Maybe you've got something like nice freezing or a leaky roof or a cracked window or something like that, right? Maybe you've got something like that it's just frustrating, right? Or maybe you've got something a little deeper. Maybe you've got like a hurt relationship or a sin that keeps nagging, keeps lingering. Right? Or maybe you've got something like really deep-seated, like a habit you can't break. Or maybe you are running from God for whatever reason. Right? Maybe you are running the opposite direction on purpose. Whatever the case, this morning I want to welcome you. I want to invite you to give that up. Right? To take those things that control, that you're holding on to, and to offer it up to God, to say, God, I don't want to cling on to this anymore. I want to let go of this control, this power that I'm trying to hold on to, this tiny little power I'm trying to hold on to, because I know that your power is so much more than my power is. Right? So the altar's open. Right? The altar's always open. Every Sunday the altar is open for you to pray about whatever you want. But this morning I want to invite you to come down and to pray to release that control. Right? You can do it down here. You can do it in your pew. If you want to kneel down in your pew, if you can fit in there, I don't know if I can fit in there. But if you want to kneel down in your pew and ask to have that control taken, whatever it takes, right? But let's do that this morning together, right? Let's take those situations that we're holding on to that power and let's let God do what God wants to do. Pray. God, thank you for this day. Thank you for your control. Thank you that you got it in your hands, and that even when we try to make things happen for ourselves and we feel bad, thank you that you are there to pick it up and fix it and to make it better. Thank you for sending your Son as a second Adam to fix what the first Adam broke. And thank you that sin is not forever, that evil is not forever. Thank you for the chance to be your sons and your daughters. Help us to live the way that you want us to live. Help us to give control over to you this morning. In Jesus' name, amen.